Hello and welcome to the EMS On Air Podcast. The mission of this podcast is to keep healthcare providers safe, informed, and prepared. Today is May 10, 2021. This episode was recorded on May 3, 2021. I'm Jeff Lassers and I'll be your host. Even though we're located in Southeast Michigan and we mention our home state a lot, today's content applies to EMS on the national and even the global scale. Today, Dr. McGraw and I welcome Dr. Edward Jauch to the show. He is the Chief of System Research at the Mission Research Institute Mission Health System. He is also an adjunct professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the Medical University of South Carolina, as well as an adjunct professor at the Departments of Emergency Medicine and Neurology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Dr. Jauch, or Ed as he prefers to be called, served as the chair of Stroke Council for the American Heart Association American Stroke Association, and was the primary author for the 2013 Acute Ischemic Stroke Guidelines. He is a co-author of the flagship American Heart Association American Stroke Association Guidelines for Telemedicine Use in Stroke, Primary Prevention of Stroke, Prehospital Care of Stroke, and Stroke Systems of Care, as well as over 20 other AHA guidelines and scientific statements. Dr. Jauch is well known in the field of acute stroke research, leading or participating in numerous Phase 2 and 3 clinical stroke trials over the last 20 years. He has over 170 publications, mostly in the area of neurologic emergencies. Ed also played a major role in the development of a statewide stroke system of care through the South Carolina Department of Health. Collectively, Dr. Jauch's efforts have focused on improving access to care, increasing the quality of acute stroke care, and educating both the public and healthcare professionals on developing integrated stroke systems of care for all patients. His experience with both neurologic emergencies and emergency medicine, along with his interest and appreciation for EMS, has made him a bit of an expert in the development of stroke systems of care from the ground up. Most recently, Ed was the primary author of the 2021 Recommendations for Regional Stroke Destination Plans in Rural, Suburban, and Urban Communities from the Prehospital Stroke System of Care Consensus Conference, which is the focus of our discussion today. This consensus paper provides local and regional EMS agencies and stroke advisory committees with guiding principles and recommendations for how to integrate the elements of a stroke system of care in 3 key regional settings: urban, suburban, and rural settings. It also takes into account the differences in resources, hospital certifications, geography, and population density. Additionally, it seeks to inform or update EMS about new models and systems of acute ischemic stroke care, especially mechanical thrombectomy for large vessel occlusion stroke, and how they affect their stroke systems of care. You can find the link to the 2021 Recommendations for Regional Stroke Destination Plans for Rural, Suburban, and Urban Communities in the episode description. In an effort to maximize the power of the recommendations, the American Heart Association American Stroke Association produced a very cool and very useful website full of resources and information directly related to helping EMS develop and or fortify their stroke systems of care. I highly recommend that you visit stroke.org/stroke transport plans and use it to evolve the stroke system of care in your community. During this episode, Dr. Jauch will help us appreciate what is at stake for stroke patients. Then we'll discuss how EMS can best serve their stroke system and strengthen their stroke chain of survival. From there, we'll get into the details of the intent and key recommendations from the consensus paper. Finally, Dr. Jauch will give his recommendations regarding how EMS systems should use the contents of this paper to improve their stroke systems of care. You can find each of our guests' email addresses in the episode description. Please keep emailing your questions, comments, feedback, and episode ideas to the EMS On Air podcast team by email at qi@ocmca.org. Also, check out our website, emsonair.com, for the latest information, podcast episodes, and other details. Follow us on Instagram at EMS On Air. And please, whatever podcast platform you use, subscribe to our podcast and leave us a rating and a review. It really helps us to grow this podcast. Thank you for listening to the EMS On Air podcast. Enjoy the episode. Good afternoon, gentlemen. How are you?
Doing great.
Good afternoon.
Well, thanks for joining us, Dr. Jauch and Dr. McGraw. With no further ado, Dr. Jauch, Ed, can you let everybody know who you are, what you do, and where you do it?
Sure. I am an emergency medicine physician by training. I started practicing back when I finished medical school in my residency at the University of Cincinnati in 1993 and was very fortunate to get exposed to stroke at a very young age. Although I wasn't young, as part of my second career, I was still formative. And I met some great people in emergency medicine and neurology who convinced me that stroke was cool and this was a great place to spend my future. So I was at the University of Cincinnati on faculty for 10 years and then went to the Medical University of South Carolina for 10 years and was the division chief and interim chair there and helped start a statewide stroke program. And 3 years ago, I moved to the mountains of Western North Carolina to become the chief of system research for the Mission Health System. And I've been here for these past 3 years.
Well, it sounds like you got some expertise there, sir.
Well, I am a one-trick pony, and so this is all I do, so I better be good at it. I spend a lot of time with the American Heart Association on various projects involving stroke and also education, and then I work at the various state levels, directing either stroke oversight committees for like South Carolina, or I currently chair the EMS subcommittee on stroke here in the state of North Carolina. So this is, again, my passion and my gig.
I got you there. And you also have some direct contact with EMS out there. You're pretty active in the teaching world too, before pre-pandemic. You're not exactly just sitting there writing papers. You're also a hands-on kind of guy, right?
I try to Boston's EMS training program and work with them and did a lot of training in the pre-hospital settings for really at the state level, trying to create integrated training modules for them and also working with my more regional ones in stroke and also doing research in the pre-hospital setting as it relates to stroke.
Well, research is a big deal, and I'm just getting into the research game now. And one of the cool things is how I got to meet you was through this paper that I got to be involved in, which was a really cool process that I hope yields a lot for other research we're conducting here in Oakland County. But before we get into that, I wanted to get your opinion on something and help us appreciate what is at stake for stroke patients.
Yeah, I think it can be boiled down to quality of life. We as emergency physicians, our goal is to have everybody survive to admission, and we rarely see what happens to these patients after they leave. And we've seen trauma patients die on our watch, we see STEMIs die on our watch. We really never see what happens to stroke patients, and they don't come in all bloody, they don't come in all screaming. They're very quiet, they sit there, and they kind of get admitted in that same state. But once you start experiencing what happens to them, especially if they aren't reperfused, and the outcomes that they have and the quality of life that they no longer have, and not only the impact on that patient, but also their families and their communities, it really is devastating. And that's not something as an emergency physician I was aware of until I started getting deeper into the field. And so for me, what's at stake is being able to return a person to a good quality of life versus being dependent. And you've probably seen this, I know Steve has probably seen this, when I have gone to a patient's bedside when I'm on call for stroke, and I give them the options of what we might do for them, including TPA. And even after I tell them, based on the original NIN study, that there was a 6.4% hemorrhage rate, almost universally, the patient or their family members, when it's a large stroke, will say, I know my fill in the blank would never want to live this way. So it's not the fear of death that really is terrifying to them. And there was actually a really cool study looking at, your aversion to an outcome. Death was an 8, and a severe cognitive, language, or even motor deficit. People don't want to live in that, quote, vegetative state. It's not a term I like to use, but this is what our people think of. And so they will take opportunities for an improvement in their current state, even if it comes with a risk of a worse state, because what they're currently in is really bad and it's not a tenable existence that they would want for their loved ones based on what they already know about their loved ones. So for me, what's at risk for not doing this right is leaving people in a quality of life state that was potentially preventable.
You make a great point that functional capacity is so impactful to people and their families. I also, like you, have had that experience where patients would elect, even in the higher NIH stroke scale, where that risk of hemorrhage is even greater than 6.4%. Those are the ones that have the highest risk, but also have the greatest reward, the greatest opportunity to improve. But there's another side of it too, and that is that patients that are left with profound disability, functional capacity, mobility, cognitive impairment, their life expectancy is wildly impacted by that outcome as well. And you're right, it isn't dramatic. It's not putting your hand on a bleeding extremity where their exsanguination is imminent. But in a weird sense, we want to almost think about it, at least in sort of the front end of stroke management, that this emergency, we're opportunistically intervening in somebody, not as dramatically, but certainly with an outcome that could be almost as dramatic. And you're so right. Patients given that opportunity would almost universally take an additional amount of risk for a better outcome.
To your point, Steve, we look at STEMI care, and I tell people, the risk of not completely reperfusing the heart is you could have an ejection fraction that goes from 60 to 30. That person's still going to have a good quality of life. Now, they may not run marathons right away, but they'll be able to return to work. They'll be able to feed themselves. They'll be able to do all those things that really embody a good quality of life. Whereas if I don't treat a stroke, and even something like an expressive language deficit is horribly disabling for patients, even if they look physically fine. And the same is true for a visual deficit, depending upon what their previous life was like. And so I tell people, we use this analogy a lot. I'm not always trying to hit a home run. I mean, that would be great if I can get them back to their pre-stroke condition. But if I can get them ambulatory, if I can get them to be able to eat safely, those little things make a huge difference in their long-term survival and their quality of life during that time. That's not something that, again, is intuitive to emergency medicine because they don't look that bad when we admit them, and we have no idea, unless we have a personal experience, what happens to them in the long run.
I think that speaks to the fact that the outcomes are really on a spectrum. And it really also looks at the fact that our data drives each one of those decisions to give them the best possible outcome based on their presentation and onset and all those other things. And that data really kind of manifests itself as a stroke systems of care, which is a term that's really been thrown around for about the last 5 to 10 years with the advent and the increase of technology and all these cool interventional things that we can do for stroke patients. So before we move on to the next thing, help us really define, in your words, what a stroke systems of care is and how it relates to our stroke chain of survival.
Sure. So I'll start a little bit more broadly, and I'll just go with what is a system of care, because we didn't invent it for stroke. We've had it for trauma, and we've certainly had it for STEMI care. So a system of care is an organized, coordinated effort in a defined geographic area that delivers the full range of care to all patients. And it's integrated with the local public health system. And so when I say local public health, that can be at the state level, that can be at the county level, that can be within your regional group. It has to engage all the various stakeholders. And what we really want to ensure is just like what we want to do in the hospital, that this system operates cohesively, that there's a seamless transition from each phase of care. So from the 911 experience to EMS, to the hospital transition where they get brought to the emergency department, to the unit, the floor, the next place they go, or they go to another hospital. We want those transitions to occur as seamlessly as possible, as quickly as possible. And we want that team, that system of care that provided that smooth transition, to have a process improvement element to this. And so we can go back and continuously improve and identify weaknesses in that system. Sometimes we can't fix it ourselves. Sometimes we have to go out and advocate for more resources. We have to advocate for money for our critical access hospitals. We have to advocate for more EMS. So a system of care, regardless of your disease state, an organized, coordinated effort around a time-dependent emergency that originates in the pre-hospital community, comes to the hospital, and then requires some form of definitive intervention to prevent the long-term morbidity and mortality associated with that disease.
I really appreciate how you connected to what we did for trauma and for others, because what I think that's important to recognize is before we had a trauma system of care, trauma care rendered in this country was really inconsistent, spotty. And, we all remember the paper that really described the origins of ATLS. I think we're at a very similar inflection point of history. And you're correct, too, that it's not going to be perfect. We're not going to make a system of care that is exactly like it's going to be. But those first steps kind of put you on a pathway with continuous improvement, self-analysis, which will ultimately lead to a better system. I always remind myself of Voltaire's comment, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Sometimes things that are an improvement is a good place to start. And certainly this is a lot like when we would only have maybe one trauma center for millions of people. Well, we went out of our way to try to get that level of competence up against the bedside of the people that needed it the most. But over years, we've even made that even better. We didn't just settle for what we started with. So I love that you analyze it in the same context.
Well, the other thing that I tell people, and when I made the decision to pursue medicine, an old physician once told me, son, there's 3 things you need to know about being a doctor. You need to be available, you need to be affable, and you need to be able. And since then, we've added affordability and we've also added accountability. So as an individual and as a system, we have to be 24/7, right? This is not 9 to 5. It's not, well, I got a golf game, I can't do this or whatever. We need to be nice about it. We need to be supportive of people who are trying their best. And if it doesn't always go right, that's not their fault necessarily. This is an opportunity to learn. And hopefully we're going to be able. We all got to this point by having a certain degree of ability. And then when I say accountability, this gets back to the importance of feedback, typically positive and in a constructive way. Even if something didn't go right, there's still an opportunity to improve the system without alienating people and without causing the system to suffer from disengagement because we're saying you did something wrong. So I think when you look at an individual as part of the team and when you look at the team and system in its toto, availability, affability, ability, affordability, yes, that would be nice. And again, accountability.
None of us should fear accountability either, right? I mean, that's the thing. If we're all going to be transparently learning from each other, accountability actually helps that happen. And nobody pretends that they've got this entirely worked out to the 100th percentile. It's a learning curve in different communities with different levels of EMS engagement. It's a journey you go on with kind of your eyes wide open.
And when it comes to data, honesty is the best policy because long-term, everybody wins.
Everybody has to trust the system. And so by sharing, being transparent, and again, I'm an engineer by training. I love numbers. I love data to drive change because it's hard to argue when it's collected correctly and it's reflective of the system. So it needs to be measurable, attributable, modifiable, and timely. Again, the SMART goals, you employ that to this system and you can actually make some fairly quick process improvements. And the good thing about this is if you share the outcomes of these patients, and you highlight the important role that each one of those members of this system of care played in that patient's good outcome, then it goes a long way to getting there and maintaining their engagement. And I'll give you an example very quickly. So we actually treated, when I was in Charleston, the former governor of the state, and he was at home. He had a stroke. He ignored it and said, I'm going to be fine. His wife said, that's nonsense. I'm going to take you to the hospital. Drove him to the hospital, came into the lobby, he was having a stroke, and actually went for thrombectomy and actually recovered fully. And so he was amnestic to the entire event. He had no recollection of this. But for him, it was important to meet every single person who touched him along the pathway that allowed him to go back to his previous state of function. We didn't have EMS involved in that particular case, but had we would have made sure they were there to see him and meet him. But he went to the triage desk in the ED lobby because that was the beginning of his journey. That was his first medical contact. And everybody that he touched was able to see him, shake his hand, and he thanked each and every one of them personally for allowing him to be there standing in front of them that day. And I'll tell you, from that day on, I didn't have to say, who cares about stroke? They all cared about stroke, and they wanted to know, how can we do more? And so that's a good outcome that you want to share. And even sometimes I've had the experience where there hasn't been a good outcome and the family member said, thank you. I said, for what? We weren't able to do what we had hoped to be able to do. And they said, you gave them every chance possible. We know that nothing was left off the table. In their own words, we can rest comfortably knowing that we did everything for them possible. And that gives us a peace of mind, even though it was not the outcome we all hoped and prayed for.
Well, I think one of the ways that any participant in that process can examine it would not only make them feel better, but would also remind them that were they or someone they love similarly in peril, they would want the system to be running 7 days a week, 24 hours a day to provide that same level of care for them. And as soon as you take the notion that this is everybody, not just any one individual, but everybody can benefit from this, it removes some of the but I really want this to work because my hospital really wants to serve the community in this particular fashion. Just get around the notion that it's for a hospital or a health system, but rather it's for a community's benefit. And the members of that community, by the way, would take that exact same argument. They would welcome the notion that you're putting aside your allegiances to any particular member of those chains and simply looking at what is going to provide the best outcome to everybody. It divorces it.
Yeah, Steve, your point's very well taken. It was interesting when I first started in Cincinnati back in the early 90s. We actually weren't the University of Cincinnati stroke team. We were the Greater Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky stroke team. Even though all of us were employed by the university, we went to every competing hospital. We were a community resource. And that allowed us to kind of get over some of the competitive nature that we see in the fierce marketplace challenges that we face. And again, if you hold it out as a non-branded, as a non-denominational, for lack of better words, community resource that is a representative of all the stakeholders in that region, at least they're offered to be at the table, then you start getting away from some of the politics that can get into this about why are you doing this? You're at the table, you know what our common denominators are when it comes to why are we doing this, and you're welcome to be as involved as you want.
We have medical control authorities in the state of Michigan. It has both good and bad. One is that the hospitals really are the medical control authority. They write the bylaws, the rules, the transportation and destination protocols with the tacit agreement of all the member hospitals. That sounds great, and it does have some upside to it. Where it gets a little dicey sometimes is when there's less participation, or when a hospital has a representative who isn't as engaged and maybe doesn't have that same level of understanding that this doesn't have to be denominational or a competitive advantage. It can be just simply a health advantage for the community. Michigan is relatively, compared to the rest of the country, very underfunded from a governmental standpoint. Whether you like the government or not, they tend to make decisions based a lot less on politics or market share than they do on what is ultimately going to provide the most and best care to the most patients, to the most members of their community, their voting public. So there's less government oversight in our system, which has some upside, but it also has some cost. And I'm thankful that we have experts like you pointing out that you don't have to let that trip you up. You can make sure that everybody's invited to the table, everyone has a role to play. That role is very important, and its overall strength as a system is really not based on anything other than where are your willingness to allow weaknesses. If you as a group say, we're going to make this as strong as we can and continue to learn from what our outcomes are, then unless you're not paying attention, your system will get better and better over time. That's going to be the crutch I lean on as we sort of explore this more deeply in the medical control authorities in Michigan.
Our system is represented by 3,000 EMS providers working for 50 different agencies who transport to over 15 hospitals and service over 1 million people. We have urban, we have rural, we have suburban. We've been really evolving our stroke system of care since we really brought in FastED and decided we needed to up our stroke game. So I want to hear from you directly, other than collecting, measuring, evaluating data, and making small steps all the time to improve your process. What are the necessary components to any stroke systems of care?
I think you have to get the Department of Health, you have to get whatever regulatory agencies you have in your locale. If you're in California, it may be county-based, since LA County has got 10 million people. That's twice the size of South Carolina. So get the health department involved. At smaller, more modest locations like the state of South Carolina and North Carolina, the Department of Health goes a long way. And a good example is New York, and we can talk about how they've done their process for developing stroke systems of care. But the Department of Health can allow you to overcome some of the politics. They can reorient people when the discussions kind of gets a little wonky and people don't get along. They, again, can give you a sense for where there are some third rails that you need to worry about because they've already experienced that with some of these other diseases or conditions. And again, an EMS rolls up to the Department of Health in the state. So sooner or later, the Department of Health, either through the EMS director, through a stroke advisory committee, whatever it happens to be, whoever's engaged at that level of overseeing that process needs to be involved. Now, that's not always going to happen, but I think that's where you first start. And if it's not at the state level, then you go more regional, depending on how they've already organized their systems of care for STEMI and trauma. So I kind of build on what's already been in place, what has been vetted by the community as an acceptable way to create systems of care for these other diseases, and then kind of layer into that how you would now do it for stroke.
In our system, all of the local protocols as written really are vetted through our state. We have an EMSCC, a coordinating council. We also have a Bureau of EMS and Trauma. And I do think, despite some of our bureaucratic micromanagement at the local level, there are very clearly defined, accepted standards, thanks to the AHA paper. But even in our relatively new and emerging research, it's becoming more and more clear that providing collaborative intervention earlier by whatever means necessary for the patient, we have clear outcome benefits. We're not sort of fumbling in the dark anymore. We have things we can actually hold on to and demonstrate. And to your point, too, I think that while we're getting it started, reminding people at that level of the sort of state oversight gives it a little bit more of an egalitarian or an ecumenical flavor. This isn't about any one group or any one EMS provider or any one hospital. This is really about the state looking out for their, in Michigan's case, 10 million citizens. And we keep coming back to the notion that all we're trying to do is make it as efficient as possible for the best outcomes, and that we do have standards. Then we can put them in place, try them out, and if need to, change them. If needed to make them stronger, do so. If needed to make them less strict in the pre-hospital criteria, a little bit wider capture, do that too. But don't wait for a perfect solution to come from the government, because in the case of Michigan, our protocols are really kind of created at the local level.
Yeah, one way that we were able to engage the departments of health is we gave them an example of the return on investment. So by putting this together and some other investments that they made, we started looking at the prevention of significant disability in South Carolina that was disproportionately being experienced by our African American men. So their 40s, their 50s, and if they're left with a modified Rankin or 3 or 4 where they're dependent, they may be at home, but now their spouse can't work because they're requiring full-time care, or they're now in a skilled nursing center. The cost to the state, the Medicaid dollars that are now incurred by a bad outcome that was potentially preventable, is not inconsequential. And so you hate to bring it back to, well, this will save you money. But the reality is that we should be doing it for the right reason, which is we want to improve this patient's quality of life and health status. But if you have to look at an ROI, if that's not sufficient, then it also is financially in the best interest of the state to build these systems of care, because the outcomes of stroke will cost them a lot more than, say, for STEMI and some of these other conditions that they've focused on in the past.
Dr. Jauch, you mentioned modified Rankin score real quick. For our EMS providers out there that don't know what that is, I think it's pretty cool. It's a great measuring stick, essentially. Can you explain
So
it to our
people
audience?
are familiar with the Cincinnati Prehospital Stroke Scale or the NIH Stroke Scale. Those are all means of quantifying a deficit of a patient. So they were actually created to do stroke research, because when you say I'm having a bad stroke, well, what does that mean? It could be really bad. It's like, well, I still don't understand what bad means. So the NIH Stroke Scale and those screens and scores are a way to quantify the neurologic deficits that the patient's experiencing. What it doesn't do is it doesn't quantify the disability that those deficits produce in the patient. So the modified Rankin scale is a disability score that looks at the patient's functional status after the event, and it categorizes them anywhere from 0, which is none, you're back to your pre-stroke state, to 6, which is you're dead. And so again, along that 0 to 6 continuum are gradations of functional outcomes. So we consider a good outcome to be a modified Rankin of 0 or 1 in most strokes, meaning that you may have a little facial droop, you may have a numb hand, but you're back at work, you're back with your loved ones, you're able to be independent. When you have the larger strokes, like we talk about with large vessel occlusions, a functional outcome of a modified Rankin of 2 is also good, because the consequences of not opening up that vessel would have left you severely disabled or dead. So you may not be perfect, but you're able to, again, to feed yourself. You can be left on your own for periods of time. You're able to ambulate, maybe with a cane, maybe with a walker, but you're able to ambulate. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but think about not being able to get up on your own, not being able to transfer out of bed, not being able to walk to the bathroom. So we use the modified Rankin as an outcome measure to look at the patient's quality of life or disability after the event, typically measured at 90 days. And it is now being recorded as part of Get With The Guidelines. It's being recorded and reported as part of the certification process by the Joint Commission and DNV, because that's what really matters to the patient. We focus on door to needle, we focus on door to groin, because we know shorter times mean a higher likelihood of a good outcome. But those are surrogates to the true outcome, which is what is the patient's functional state. And so the tool that we use, the yardstick that we commonly use, is what's called the modified Rankin scale.
Yeah, and I wanted to make sure we did that because you got to have a way to score your wins, right? And the other thing is how to know what's the increase in the modified Rankin score of patients that meet this criteria that get thrombolysis, or those that get mechanical thrombectomy. And when you can express it as, well, these same patients got this treatment A versus treatment B, and they had a lower modified Rankin under this path. Well, that's pretty good data. So that yardstick is a really big deal to understand when you're talking stroke and the impact of your system of care.
And it is. And it's also, I think, important because stroke oftentimes, unlike, say, I have an emergency appendectomy, I get the appendix out, I'm back to normal. Whereas that's not always the case with stroke, given the fragility of the brain to ischemia. But what we try to do is we try to shift the curve. We try to take patients who are going to be in a bad health state based on their modified Rankin and move them up. We may move them up to a 0, which would be great. But again, going from a 4 to a 1 is a phenomenal improvement in that patient's health state. It's not a home run, meaning that they're not back to normal, but their ability to live an independent life is now much greater than if we had not done anything at all. So we try to shift health states to a more favorable area. To your point, Jeff, we judge our interventions based on that shift that occurs. And so it's not always dichotomous. Did they get back to normal? Well, that's not a good yardstick for some diseases where, even if you got to them right away, normal is not a possible, like intracerebral hemorrhage, right? So a similar disease state, if we can get to them early, we might be able to mitigate some of the outcomes of those patients, but we may not be capable of making them perfect, but we can make them better.
Yeah, and again, that circles back to, the outcome is a spectrum. Now, I want to kind of tie together stroke systems of care and the stroke chain of survival. So how do you leverage your stroke system of care in conjunction with your stroke chain of survival? You can kind of compare and contrast the two.
Well, you can. And I think the stroke chain of survival actually represents the various transition points that a patient goes through when they have their acute stroke. And so if you have that framework or that scaffolding upon which you know that they're going to start from wherever they have their stroke to the action that's necessary for them to recognize the stroke, to the action that is call 911, which again, 2/3 patients still use 911, the other third don't, which is a big challenge. And so the next transition is if they say the word stroke to 911, we know the dispatch will be different. And we look at the EMS response. And again, if they're dispatched for stroke, that response will be different. The transition to, if they think it's the stroke and they then provide the encode of the hospital's reception of that patient will be different. So we look at those transitions that are represented in the stroke chain of survival, and we try to build systems of care that reflect those particular environments. And again, make sure that those transitions are seamless, that there's a continuum, just like, when patients transfer from the ED to the floor, that's where bad things happen, or they go from the floor to the unit, that's where bad things happen. Transitions of care is where we have problems with communication and the patients suffer from that. So how do you build a system of care to facilitate the development of each one of those links to the top of their capabilities, and then making sure that the transition from link to link to link by using that system of care that you've created is seamless?
I like that you point that out. One of the other things we can look back at trauma is that we all learn to speak the same language. Ourselves and the trauma surgeons and the orthopedic surgeons, the vascular surgeons, we all use the same approach to the polytrauma patient. This is very similar in that we have pre-hospital providers now doing a pre-hospital stroke screen or a scale that dovetails very nicely and uses some of the exact same elements that we use in the NIH stroke scale. So again, we're kind of minimizing the risk of those transitions where you're correct. That seems to be the greatest point where we have additional risk. But by speaking the same language, using the same kind of vernacular and the same urgency to tease out the mildly impaired from the severely impaired, making that sort of a fork in the road, we're really then providing, in some ways, the limited resources that all communities have. Not every hospital is going to be able to do a thrombectomy. It's just unaffordable, and the talent hasn't yet been created. But if we, in some ways, stratify people using those same words and those very similar scaling techniques, more often than not, we're going to get people that need the particular higher end talent and capability brought to bear.
Jeff brought this up in a previous conversation. There was a day that emergency physicians were not allowed to give fibrinolysis or thrombolysis to patients with STEMI. It was kept behind glass. We had to break it in case of an emergency, and only after a cardiologist gave us their blessing. Many things had to change for us to finally be able to do that unilaterally, because we had to convince them we could read an EKG. We could say they have 2 millimeters of ST wave elevation in these leads with reciprocal changes, and the right heart leads show this. And I think when we started speaking their language and we were able to communicate effectively with them, we were able to start doing things quicker and more appropriate for the patient. And now Our pre-hospital care providers can look at an EKG and they can see, I got 2 millimeters of ST wave elevation, activate the cath lab. We've come a long way in 20 years, and stroke is very analogous to that. And as we speak the same language and we understand what is being told to us at each step of that transition, that common language, A, builds trust, and B, it actually benefits the patient because we're able to more effectively bring in the commensurate resources with the severity of whatever their condition happens to be and make it in a more appropriate use of resources. You don't want to activate the cath lab every time somebody who comes in looking weak and dizzy. But if you activate the cath lab or put people on notice when they have a fast DD or a race score above a certain threshold, that's a commensurate response for the severity of the patient that is being communicated to us by that common language. And so I view the stroke scales and scores and understanding how to quantify and describe a neurologic deficit essential for a stroke system of care to function appropriately.
Yeah, it's such a smart move by all of the creators of many of these stroke severity scales to start with the NIH and maintain some of the terminology. Because again, when I'm saying things like expressive and receptive aphasia to a physician and they're like, oh, he understands the difference between the two, I'm getting buy-in from that physician. He might not know me or she might not know me, but they're like, this person sounds pretty dialed in right now. They're giving me some pretty good evidence to lead me down that road to activate the stroke team. And so, yeah, communication solves a lot of problems on many fronts, right? Not just this situation. So, Dr. Jauch, as we build our stroke systems of care, not only here in Oakland County, but we EMS and healthcare systems around the entire world, we really look for guidance. And a lot of times we get a hold of the American Heart Association, the American Stroke Association. And along the way of the route Dr. McGraw and I have been doing the stroke study in our county, well, I kind of got invited to be a part of your writing group for this really cool paper that was published recently. Can you give us the intent and key recommendations from this article and really what it's all about and how it ties into stroke systems of care?
Sure, Jeff. So this is actually a consensus paper that originated from a conference that we held very hastily back in 2018, concurrent with the 2018 International Stroke Conference in Los Angeles County. And in part, it was an important time to have it because we had just started working with LA County to address a challenge that they were facing. And as I mentioned, LA County has 10 million people, 88 cities, lots of beautiful people. But they only had, I think, 4 comprehensive stroke centers at the time, and they're all in the western part of the city. And yet EMS was being told you need to take stroke patients only to comprehensive stroke centers. Well, that was going to be a challenge. If you're out in Pomona in the east side of the county, if you've ever been to LA, you can't drive anywhere. It's easier to fly to New York and then fly into LAX than it is to drive across the county. So it was unlikely that many of those hospitals were going to be able to achieve comprehensive stroke center certification because of the lack of the other types of strokes that they need to care for to reach the standards. And so subarachnoid in particular was difficult for many of these hospitals that didn't have those facilities. So we started considering, should we be able to recognize hospitals that can safely perform endovascular therapy comparable to how a comprehensive stroke center does it, but only focusing on mechanical thrombectomy. So they have to be a primary stroke center first, and then they have to have this additional capability with the same standards as a comprehensive to provide endovascular therapy. So that pilot project was created in LA by the Joint Commission to create that recognition for certification that then can be used in designation, right? So certification is a third-party attestation of a certain quality of care for that specific disease. Destination is how we as a group in that system of care work with EMS to say, where do you go? A lot of places, rightfully so, use these third-party certifications as the framework upon which you decide where should a patient go depending upon certain variables. So this somewhat hastily convened consensus of all the various stakeholders from the various medical societies, from state EMS, from both rural and from urban areas, were brought together in Los Angeles County to just discuss what are our shared goals, what are our shared challenges, and what recommendations can we bring forward. We didn't want to get too hung up on the definitions of urban, suburban, and rural. We kind of know what they look like when you see them. But rather, we wanted to first say, what are common obstacles that every location face? What are common opportunities that every location can have? And then we broke out into subgroups and we said, what is specific to rural? What is specific to urban areas? What's specific to suburban areas? So again, rural areas may not have full-time EMS. They may be volunteers. How do we utilize a volunteer healthcare system versus an urban one that has full-time paramedics that spend a lot of time in training? So we came up with the various subgroups that looked at the 3 geographic areas, and we came up with what we thought would be reasonable considerations for what resources are needed. So we can use this also as an advocacy tool, but also what are some of the reasonable transport times that may be considered for a specific region to ensure the patient gets to the right place the first time, based upon our ability to detect a stroke in the pre-hospital setting, and then more importantly now within the vascular therapy, how to quantify that stroke severity using a severity assessment tool. I think what's important about this, just like the guidelines, they are not meant to be etched in stone. They're not meant to be absolutes. They're not meant to be prescriptive. They're meant to be used as a starting point of conversations for a particular region and to be thought-provoking. What do we think makes sense based on the resources that we have in our region? And even though one rural area may be defined as rural, in eastern Montana, that's going to look very different than what rural South Carolina may look like. And I might have a comprehensive stroke center within an hour's drive in rural South Carolina, whereas there's not a single comprehensive stroke center in all of Montana. So again, they're both rural, but how do I incorporate some of those processes and thoughts and recommendations uniquely in my practice setting? So that's what this paper was intended to do. And like I said, we were extremely fortunate that we had people attend, that we were able to get consensus from all the various organizations that were there, including the National Association of EMS Physicians, the National Association of State EMS Officials, and others. And that is deliberate, and it really reflects the importance of EMS in a stroke system of care. This is not a bunch of doctors pontificating what we think is best, but this is bringing other key stakeholders and constituencies to the table because they know what they need and they know the challenges they face better than I will ever recognize from my hospital chair. And I think the other thing that it starts to really highlight, and as we're learning, again, mechanical thrombectomy was first brought to bear in 2015 with a series of large trials. So this is fairly new. And so in Steve's previous podcast about stroke, we are going to celebrate the 25th anniversary of thrombolysis with alteplase being approved by the FDA of June of 1996. Stroke is a youngster on the grand scheme of things. And with mechanical thrombectomy being now just 5 years out from being approved and really endorsed as part of our standard of care armamentarium, we are just toddlers in developing this process. And so this paper was a way for people to kind of, who are just starting from scratch, which remarkably some people are, and those who are a little bit more evolved or mature could kind of use it as a way to say, what are our next steps? What are things that we're missing? Or what are some of the considerations that we need to have? And one that really has become somewhat problematic, and we've seen this with STEMI, is the door in, door out. How do we facilitate interfacility transfers? We don't have in Western North Carolina a third-party private interfacility transport company. And so we rely on our local EMS to transport patients from hospital A to hospital B. And when you're in rural anywhere and you take the single ambulance out of service for doing a 2-hour transfer, we also have to look at the impact that that decision has on the rest of the people in that coverage area, should they have a STEMI, a trauma, whatever it happens to be. So I think it's important for us to understand and appreciate that we can design the most perfect stroke system of care possible, but we have to appreciate the consequences of that system on other health conditions and the people that we serve. And this, I think, one of the benefits of having all these people come together and say stroke is important, we need to do this, is a way to go back and advocate for resources at our state level and some of the other regions that can bring some of these resources that we desperately need.
Like you in Michigan, our interfacility transporters are also the responders in the vast majority of the cases to 911. So you're exactly similar in us in that you're going to try to make the best decisions you can, knowing that the resources are patently limited. And that's another argument to try to get people, if you can choose to do so, to the hospital that they're most likely going to wind up getting to anyway with one, but not two rides.
Yes.
Can you help us describe how an EMS system should use this consensus paper and the information contained within it in order to improve their stroke systems of care? Now, you and I had an opportunity to really talk about this. There was a couple big things about it that I'd love you to express to our audience.
Oh, I hope I remember them. No pressure, Jeff. Thank you. Again, I think you don't want EMS to work unilaterally and just say, we're going to start doing this. It needs to be within the system of care. And they need to be doing this with both, and I want to say this in a bad way, but guidance, and also feedback. And so this document should give them some opportunities to go to their regional system of care and say, what is our role? How do we work within this? This is what we need. We need either education, we need a singular tool, we need some guidance as to what types of patients you would like to be brought where. And again, how do we make this an iterative process where we can continuously improve upon what we're doing and learning from our experiences? So I don't know if that's what we talked about, Jeff, but
yeah, that's exactly what we talked about, actually.
One of the things I really like too is you sort of take the desired outcome, the right patient with the right level of service required, and say, okay, if we want them here or we want them over there, how do we reverse engineer the process to make that more likely than not? That also helps to answer some of the questions along the way. Who needs to know what? Who needs to be notified how? What redundancy has to be available? All those, I think, help to become more logical when you start out where you want them to be and then figure out just how to get them there. And who has to know what to do that?
That's a great point.
What other recommendations can you make to our EMS systems, our regional healthcare systems that are part of EMS? What other recommendations can you make to them in this realm of stroke, either with this paper, without the paper? What else should they really consider in the same vein?
I think at the end of the day, inclusivity is going to really be important for sustaining a system of care and getting buy-in. Systems of care can fall apart fairly easily if they're not maintained and if they're not cultivated with the right intent. And so I think you need to sit down every now and then and revisit who's at the table, who should be at the table, who could be affected by the decisions that we're making. So if your state has a hospital association, they obviously will be there. If your state has a hospital association for rural hospitals, they should be there, right? Because they may not be represented by your hospital association. And so that was a nuance that I didn't really appreciate until I forgot to invite the Rural Hospital Association because I didn't know it existed. So I think that we need to sit down and ask the people around the table who else should be here. Now, you have to be careful in that you can make it too cumbersome by having too many stakeholders. And that's why when I have been working on stroke systems of care at a state level, it also includes rehab, it includes prevention, it includes the entire continuum. But just like it is with other things that we try to do, if you try to put that all together in one big mother of all stroke systems of care, it's going to be too cumbersome and too large and too unwieldy, and you won't get anywhere. So let's focus on what we can manage, which is the acute stroke phase right now. We build successes on that. We continue to show the benefit of that system of care by patient outcomes, the health state of those patients, and also the impact on healthcare costs within the state. And then you start layering on these additional pieces that need to be there, like recovery and rehab, and then eventually prevention. I'd like to be out of business. I'm glad I don't have to take stroke call at 3 a.m. So how do we really use and leverage this system of care then to kind of go back upstream and start advocating for the things that will prevent patients from even developing risk factors from stroke? Trying to do that all at once is a Herculean effort that is pretty much doomed to fail.
Like we said earlier, it's all about making little adjustments all the time rather than trying to make a big giant push. That exponential interest that we're building on those little moves every day is so powerful.
It's a Southern term, I think, but it's like, how do you boil a frog? It's slowly. If you just put it in a pot of hot water, it's going to jump out. But if you do it real slowly, it's not going to know that it's being poached. That's the thing. People get alarmed when you come in and you're a bull in a china shop and you try to change everything. You're like, we're going to just deconstruct everything and we're going to rebuild it. That immediately will create barriers that are unnecessary. But start with some of the low-hanging fruit, find a victory that can be shared with everybody so that everybody becomes invested in the process, and then build upon that largesse and that goodwill that first victory happened to have had produced.
I got to tell you, what you said about including lots of disparate people is enormously valuable. And then the one you just said as well, is if you let the bull in the china shop, usually the big comprehensive center, come in and tell everyone else what's going to happen. They don't know this when they start out, but they learn it quickly. That's not a way to get anybody to see the world through their perspective. You've really got to do the exact opposite, this sort of mental jujitsu, and say, okay, I'm a big comprehensive stroke center and my neuroradiologist is here with me. But what would I do if I was one of these rural or suburban hospitals that doesn't have my capability? What would I want to know? And what would I want offered to me and mine in order to make the system sort of a win for everybody? I was at a state meeting when that behavior was not really expressed, and it didn't go well. I'll
No.
just say it.
I have a diagram of all sorts of cartoons of what a stroke system of care looks like. And I typically will have the comprehensive stroke center in the middle like a black hole. And I said, that is not the goal. It is not creating this big sucking sound, bringing in stroke patients from every, geography around it. It is meant to serve as a resource. It's a core resource for everybody. And the arrows of patients and information flow are bidirectional. So in the perfect world, not everybody needs to go there. Once they go there, it'd be nice if they went back to their home hospital to recover. And the flow of information, feedback, best practice, updates, training, all that, that's the responsibility of those comprehensive stroke centers. If they want to be that regional resource, and if they want those patients, then it comes with an obligation to step up and to serve the community through these other areas to ensure that, rising tide floats all boat. You want every hospital in your region to benefit from being part of that system of care and elevate their stroke care to the highest capabilities that hospital potentially can be. Because again, we know that patients don't call EMS and they're going to show up at these hospitals. We know that some patients won't get transferred. So it's our obligation as a system of care is to elevate care everywhere and to really make sure that nobody falls through the cracks because of what we had developed.
Yeah, shout out to Beaumont Hospital in Royal Oak, Michigan, who is a comprehensive stroke center. They were the first comprehensive in our study. The other hospital in the study, St. Joseph Mercy Oakland, fantastic hospital as well. They're thrombectomy capable. And when we were talking about the destination protocol, if any changes had to be made, the comprehensive center, Beaumont Royal Oak, was adamant that they did not want all patients to go to their hospital because they said, we can't service them all. They knew that if they got all the patients, that you get this diffusion of ability because you can't give everybody 100% of your attention. They understood that the closest one of those two hospitals was the right hospital for that patient experiencing a stroke. So there are those comprehensive centers out there that are doing the right thing. Unfortunately, that's not always the case, especially when you're developing a new system when you can kind of get a grab at, a say in where things happen.
Well, the challenge will always be practice makes perfect, just like a pitcher, just like a violinist. And you want a proceduralist who's doing your surgery to have done more than one that year. And so we do need to make sure that we observe what is our threshold for volume. And it's not just volume with the proceduralist, it's volume for the entire system. When that team has a chance to practice and do this day in, day out, they get better at it just like anything else. But you can overwhelm the system, right? So it's not just that it becomes asthmatotic. You can actually go over the curve, like the Starling curve. You can actually get on the dysfunctional side because you've got too much going on and you just can't spend the attention. But that really is regionally specific. If you had 6 comprehensive stroke centers within a mile of each other, then you could take every stroke patient to a comprehensive because there's the bandwidth. But that's not always the case. And I do think that we're going to get to a point where we will no longer measure a hospital's performance based on what resources you have, but rather how did your patients do? And once we get their outcomes, I don't care what your certification is. If you can show me great door-to-needle times, great door-to-groin times, patient-modified Rankins that are phenomenal, good recovery, good secondary prevention, I don't care because I know that hospital has done what is necessary to produce the outcomes that are patient-centric.
That is an absolutely true statement. And you think about no different than our American College of Surgeons ranking their open heart hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
We don't care that you can do valves and bypass and all this. We just want to know what's your mortality? What's your 30-day mortality? And what do your patients do after they have operations there? And if you're a university center or you're a community hospital, we're going to look at you the same. I think that's brilliant. And scar you 1, 2, or 3 based on your outcomes. That's the coming thing. You're right. I've really enjoyed interacting with you, Ed. Gosh, you've got so much experience, and I think you've probably heard a million questions asked, but a lot of them kind of come back to the same themes. Experience is really helpful.
Actually, I learn something every time I do something like this. And the one I learned from Montana, which was a fascinating question, is if we need more resources and a lot of places are understaffed, why don't we charge for stroke activations like we do trauma activations? And that would then take that money, go back and build in telemedicine, build in access to neurology, build in 24/7 CT scan. And I thought that's a great idea. Probably not doable, but I just found it fascinating is that if time is that important and building a cohesive team to respond in a timely fashion is what really is the secret sauce to a patient's outcome, why wouldn't you pay for that? Why wouldn't you reimburse a system that has that kind of an outcome?
Before I let you go, I want to talk about this really cool website you guys put together. When I say you guys, I mean the American Stroke Association. And if you go to stroke.org/stroke transport plans, this is a really cool website. So, Dr. Jauch, walk us through why it exists and what's there for our EMS systems looking for guidance on this
so
topic.
I think, despite the white paper being, I think, a really nice document, no one's going to spend the time to read it. And again, you want to make it practical. You want the contents to be practical for people. And so, like a lot of things that are developed either from guidelines or from ACLS, we often translate it into something that is more visually appealing, and also we remember things when put into these structures. So this consensus paper and others that have come out recently were kind of distilled down into this website that provides a distilled version of some of the recommendations, some of the considerations, and shows how they can be put into a system of care, starting with 911 to where they need to finally go. That was the point of having these kind of infographics like so many people now use to convey important messages.
Well, thank you. We're going to put the link in the episode description. I really recommend that you look at this website. It's really cool. It's got some fantastic resources on it, especially if your agency or system is doing any stroke education or consideration of structuring its stroke systems of care. No matter what level, if you've been doing this for 5 years, 10 years, or you're just getting geared up for stroke in your system, this is a really cool website to kind of check out and understand where you're at with your conditions.
And Jeff, I'll add, when you see the infographics and you see the various recommendations for the geographic regions of rural, suburban, and urban, you'll see specific time measures in there, time metrics of bypass or triage or whatever. And again, getting to our previous point, these are not meant to be absolute etched in stone prescriptive numbers. These are meant to be starting points and references for the discussion, considering the unique resources that your particular stroke system of care and your particular region happen to have. So if your number doesn't look exactly like what the infographic looks like, it's probably because you fine-tuned it and you refined it to be more applicable to your particular region.
From a practicing physician like yourself, I'm grateful that you've distinguished between rural, suburban, and urban EMS systems, because they do have some things in common, and they also have some things that are relatively unique to their population density and the distances they have to travel. And all those are reflected in your infographics. So as a pragmatic, boots on the ground emergency physician, thank you very much for that provision in there. I think it's great.
We really appreciate your time today, sir. We're going to have you back. Whether you like it or not, we're going to get you to come back on a whole bunch of episodes. This is working out really well. We look forward to the next one.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jeff and Steve.
All the best, guys. Appreciate it.
That is all for the show today, everyone. Thank you for listening, and thank you to Dr. McGraw and Dr. Jauch for joining me. I look forward to more episodes with these two fine gentlemen. I really enjoyed my time today. Please keep emailing your questions, comments, feedback, and episode ideas to the EMS On Air podcast team by email at qi@ocmca.org. Also, check out our website, emsonair.com, for the latest information, podcast episodes, and other details. Follow us on Instagram at EMS On Air, and please, whatever podcast platform you use, subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and a review. Thank you for listening to the EMS On Air podcast. Stay safe and have a great day.